founder and CEO of the Institute for Energy Research, and I'd like to welcome this full room and many people who are listening via the internet to this panel on the theoretical and real-world problems of a federal tax on carbon dioxide, CO2. This event is sponsored by the Institute for Energy Research, a public policy educational foundation headquartered here in Washington, D.C. Nearly 25 years ago, I founded IER to provide a scholarly, free market perspective on energy history and energy policy debates. Today, IER can claim to be the nation's leading free market energy organization under the direction of our President, Tom Pyle. I'd like to begin my moderator comments by putting today's tax issue in some historical context before introducing our four panelists. Today's debate is the third try for a major energy tax related to the issue of climate change. The first was the Clinton BTU tax, which died 20 years ago in 1993. And note that the BTU tax began as a carbon tax, but it got polluted in the real world. The second energy climate tax debate was a federal cap and trade legislation that died in 2009. Today's third try at a climate-related tax has one major difference, however, from the previous two. It has far less political support and prospects than before from the White House, Congress, Wall Street, and Main Street. And I might note that in today's New York Times, there's a story out of Australia that the Premier, Kevin Rudd, canceled the planned carbon tax. He said, quote, "The government has decided to terminate the carbon tax to help cost of living pressures for family and to reduce costs for small businesses." But if it be said that we are beating a dead horse today, there is a seance of sorts going on to try to bring a carbon tax to life on two grounds. One, that a CO2 tax is economically efficient compared to the status quo. And two, that a CO2 tax can be non-political, revenue neutral, and the rest of it. Now, you have heard about the carbon tax being a win-win, a double dividend, a tax on bads rather than goods. Now, we do know by simple math that a unilateral U.S. carbon tax will not have a discernible effect on global climate. As one pundit put it, quote, "Nature will not notice a U.S. carbon tax." And Chip Knappenberger has done the math, plugging in the anticipated CO2 reductions into IPCC climate models, and the result is a tenth of a degree, 50 to 100 years out from unilateral U.S. carbon action. But the U.S. economy will notice a carbon tax, as will everyone in the economy as producers and consumers. A carbon tax is an energy tax, since more than 80% of American energy today comes from fossil fuels, carbon-based energy, oil, gas, and coal. So returning to the question of this panel, is there an economic justification for a CO2 tax? We have four experts with us today. The first two speakers will address more of the technical issues of the CO2 tax. The last two will be more real-world oriented toward the real-world politics and economic effects of such a levy. Our first speaker is Dr. Robert Murphy, Senior Economist at the Institute for Energy Research. Bob received his doctorate in economics from New York University and joined IER in 2007. He is a specialist in climate economic analysis as well as other related tax and budget issues. Our second speaker is Dr. Ross McKittrick, Professor of Economics at the University of Guelph, and author of graduate-level text, Economic Analysis of Economic Policy, that's used in a number of graduate programs in the U.S. and Canada. Ross is an expert on the economics of climate policy as well as statistical assessments of climate models and paleoclimate reconstruction. He will discuss the distortionary effects of introducing a carbon tax into a pre-existing tax system. The third speaker in from Canada is Dr. Kenneth Green, Senior Director of Energy and Natural Resource Studies at the Fraser Institute. Ken received his doctorate in economic science and engineering from UCLA and has been involved in environmental policy issues for the last 20 years. Yep. Ken is well known here in Washington for his years at the American Enterprise Institute, and he was also economic director of the Environmental Literacy Council here in Washington. Ken has been particularly involved in the climate change debate with testimony before House and Senate subcommittees, and he was a designated expert reviewer for 2 reports by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Our final speaker is Dr. David Krutzer, Research Fellow in Energy Economics and Climate Change at the Heritage Foundation here in Washington. David received his doctorate in economics at George Mason University, and in a previous life was an economics professor, small-town mayor, and council. David's work at the Heritage Foundation Center for Data Analysis investigates how energy and climate change legislation will affect economic activity at the national, local, and state levels. Now, our format is each of the 4 panelists will speak for approximately 15 minutes, and we will leave time for questions and answers. And we have provided note cards, I believe, for all of you. If you will write down your questions, we will collect them, and as moderator, I will read the questions and ask the panelists for answers. So we're going to begin with Robert Murphy and then go to Ross, Ken, and David. And I introduce Bob Murphy, the organizer of this conference.
Thanks, Rob, for that introduction. Thank you, everyone, for showing up. We appreciate your interest in energy or the free food, whichever it may be. But we want to, what the function of this conference is, one of the things I want to get across is, we're economists, professional economists, working in climate change issues, energy issues, and the narrative that a lot of the media puts out and coverage of policy debates about what the consensus is in terms of climate change issues does not actually accord with what's in the published economics peer-reviewed literature. And so that's part of what I want to make sure you guys walk away with today, and that's what I'm going to be covering in Ross and his talk as well, is just going over some of the standard results in the published economics literature about climate change issues, and I think you'll be surprised by what we show you. Let me just also mention that the PowerPoints that I'm going to be going over in Ross, there's some slides in there with a lot of information and graphs, and if you want us to provide those to you, just contact us and we'll provide them for you. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about is the social cost of carbon, and again, I'm going to be just going over some things that are well established in this literature that economists practicing in this field know, but I think you'll see that some of these issues are pretty surprising given the way the public debate has been framed. Okay, so the social cost of carbon, what is it? I'm taking this from the White House's technical support document. So there was, in case you're not aware, there was a working group that the Obama administration established, and in 2010 they first published an estimate of the so-called social cost of carbon, and then they updated it in 2013. And so they define it as an estimate of the monetized damages associated with an incremental increase in carbon emissions in a given year. So just to step back for a minute, the big picture is there's computer models that show that there's damages from climate change, and of course those are driven by CO2 emissions, among other things. And so what the social cost of carbon is supposed to be conceptually is saying, okay, the computer says if you give off a ton of emissions today, what effect is that going to have down the road? And it actually runs through 2300 is what these particular simulations were calibrated for. And then in the computer simulation, it keeps track of the damages and sees how much additional climate change damages there are going to be from one more ton of emissions at whatever year we're talking about. And then they add up all those damages and then discount them to the present, and they come up with a dollar figure. So that's what the social cost of carbon is. Now, later on, I'm going to show you sometimes that process or that procedure spits out a negative number. So just keep in mind what that means if the social cost of carbon were to be negative, is that emitting a ton of emissions confers benefits on third parties. Okay, one last little caveat before we get into the details here. Just be careful when you're looking at this stuff. Sometimes people quote the social cost of carbon in terms of carbon dioxide, other times, though, in terms of carbon itself. And so one number, you just multiply it by a factor to convert from one to the other. So just be careful that you're looking at apples to apples when you're looking at various definitions and estimates. Okay, so to give you a frame of reference, the White House's recent estimate, the one that just came out in May, just to give you an idea of what they're talking about, they say in the year 2010, using a 3% discount rate, and later on in my remarks I'll explain why you have to specify the discount rate, that's really important. They're saying up in 2010 it's $33 a ton. And then you see it rises over time. Okay, so that was the estimate as of May 2013. You might say, okay, well, what do these numbers mean? What are they going to be used for? Why do we care about this? Well, already the function of these estimates in the working group is to guide federal agencies in cost-benefit analysis of proposed regulatory actions. So, for example, they might argue, okay, well, the Keystone Pipeline, if that leads to increased emissions, how are we going to quantify the climate change impact of that? So they need to know, or some other, fuel economy standards, if they want to say, okay, this will reduce emissions a certain amount relative to the baseline if we didn't impose these new fuel economy standards. They want to be able to quantify and say, what are the costs and benefits of that? And so the social cost of carbon is used to say, well, we want to capture and monetize, quantify the alleged benefits because of the fact that there's lower emissions. So that's what it's being used for. In the economics literature itself, the social cost of carbon is very closely related to proposals to levy a carbon tax. So it's pretty close to, if you do it a certain way, that the so-called optimal carbon tax in terms of correcting the market economy and letting people take account of their emissions and the effect they're having on third parties. The social cost of carbon is the number that the proposals say should be used. Okay, so clearly this is a very important concept, and so now I just want to walk you guys through and show you these numbers, for example, the ones I just showed you in the White House's recent estimate, where these numbers are coming from, and I want to show you how malleable they are. Okay, so one way to put it is, you might get the impression that the social cost of carbon is this very technical thing, that it's a feature of the world that's out there, and that the scientists in their white lab coats are measuring it, sort of like the radius of the moon or the charge on an electron. And what I want to tell you is, it's not like that at all. That these numbers are driven, and understandably so, just because of the nature of what it is, they're driven by a lot of assumptions that go into these computer models, and you'll see what I mean in a moment. You can make the number high or low just by tweaking certain parameters. Okay, one thing though you need to understand as a backdrop to all this is that in several of these peer-reviewed economics of climate change literature studies of the effects of global warming, actually many studies show that for moderate levels of warming, up through 2 degrees Celsius or so, there's actually net benefits on the globe. And it's only with additional warming that then things turn negative. And you're going to need to understand that to see why later on some of those estimates of the social cost of carbon are negative, meaning carbon emissions, according to those studies, are a good thing in terms of helping the rest of humanity beyond the benefit of the person using the carbon. Okay, so again, this is just coming from peer-reviewed literature, just showing various estimates. So here, in this region, these are benefits of global warming. You see it only later crosses below the 0 point for additional warming. Okay, so big picture, and then I'll show you, I'll substantiate these claims in a second, but let me just give you the big picture here. In the published literature, the estimates of the social cost of carbon, they're very uncertain. Okay, so they're all over the map, and that just underscores that this is not some objective number out there that we can all agree on the way scientists could agree, again, like on the radius of the moon or something like that. These are all over the map, and moreover, the estimates I'll show you in a minute have actually come down generally over the last few years. Furthermore, the peer-reviewed estimates, so estimates of this social cost of carbon that are in the peer-reviewed literature are much lower typically than the ones in the non-peer-reviewed literature. And that makes sense because there's less constraints if it's not going to be peer-reviewed, and so they can put in assumptions that are more divergent from what their peers are doing. So there's a lot of information on this slide, but let me just walk you through it because it's pretty important. So this comes from Richard Toll's survey of the literature. Each dot here represents a particular published study's estimate of the social cost of carbon. So this axis over here is the dollar figure. So you can see, and this x-axis here is the publication date. So you can see early on, back in the early 90s, here was the cluster of estimates. And now as time passes, you can see they get ever wider. See this one way up here? As you can see, they're actually over time getting more sporadic. This right here, this dotted line, is Toll's sort of boundaries for the 90% confidence interval. So that's what I meant in the previous slide when I said the estimates are getting more uncertain over time. So it's not as if the economists out there are converging on this is what the social cost of carbon is. In fact, over time, the estimates are getting more open-ended. The other thing I want to bring to your attention is, look down here, there's a bunch of estimates below the zero line. So that means it's in the region where there's a negative social cost of carbon, so that carbon confers net benefits. Okay, so again, this is being used to drive regulatory action because of the social cost of carbon, and they are spitting out numbers saying it's $33 a ton and so forth, when you can see in the actual peer-reviewed literature that it's, the estimates are becoming more uncertain over time. In under several parameter choices, it's actually negative, meaning in the framework we're talking about, ironically, that would mean, oh, the government should be subsidizing CO2 emissions because it's conferring benefits on everybody. Okay, I mentioned in the peer-reviewed estimates, the average that Toll found in his survey was $22 a ton. If it's not peer-reviewed, the average of those studies of the estimate was $81 a ton. So again, you can see the big discrepancy. And that's why I'm mentioning this, because if you go out and you'll see some people commenting, for example, when the White House's May update came out, a lot of people who are very aggressively for a carbon tax were pointing to that and saying things like, well, they're moving in the right direction, but the real estimates, the people in the know think it could be as high as, and they'll throw out a very high figure, $180 a ton. And so I'm just explaining to you that yes, there are estimates all over the map, but typically the ones that are extremely high are coming from non-peer-reviewed sources. Okay, let me mention, I got two more main points to make for you guys I want you to walk away with from my talk. There's two important issues. One is this issue of domestic versus global, and then we're going to come back to the choice of the discount rate. So right now, the domestic versus global, the issue is, and this is coming from the White House's working group study, they're explaining, again, they're giving guidance to federal agencies saying when you're running cost-benefit on proposed policies, these are the guidelines you're going to use to conduct those cost-benefit tests. And when it comes to the social cost of carbon, they deviated from two of those guidelines. So one thing is, they're quoting from OMB's guidance. Under OMB guidance, analysis of regulations from the domestic perspective is required. And then in the working group document, they say, however, and they go on to explain why they're not going to do that when it comes to the social cost of carbon. And this is significant because they themselves estimate that if you were to adjust the figures they give for the global social cost of carbon to convert that to say, well, yeah, but what's the cost of carbon domestically to the United States, you would have to multiply it, adjust it by a figure of 7 to 23%. So let me just show you what that would mean. This is what was reported in the media when the White House working group update came out in May. They were saying, oh, the social cost of carbon in 2010 is about $33 a ton according to this new estimate, and then it goes up over time like this. If they had followed OMB guidance and reported it in terms of the domestic impact, these are the numbers they would be publishing in that range, because multiplying these by 7% on the low end and 23% on the high end. So instead of saying it's $33 a ton, they could have said it's $2 a ton, possibly that low. So you can see the huge impact that has and why I think that they chose to do it in the global report, because that gives them a bigger number. All right, you can see how if they did it domestically, there wouldn't be much impetus for action. Okay, the final main point I want to bring up is that the discount rate is crucial. So let's step back and make sure I don't lose you guys. Why is this so relevant? Because of this point right here. Remember, there's these computer models, and in the working group's calibrations, they ran through the year 2300. And in certain scenarios with certain emission trajectories, and if there's a high sensitivity of the Earth's climate to carbon dioxide emissions, that temperature rises quickly in certain choices of their parameters, there can be huge impacts on the global economy, that perhaps losing 25% of GDP centuries in the future in a worst case scenario. And so what's driving the estimates of today's social cost of carbon or in the near future, a lot of it is these embedded damages that are decades or even centuries in the future, but that are huge. And so if you understand how discounting works, well, if you want to convert a $1 billion loss 200 years from now into today's monetary terms, you need to know what interest rate do I use or what discount rate. So the higher the discount rate, it means the less significance you attribute to that distant event because you're discounting it more heavily. So that's why this number is so big when it comes to the climate change debate, because a lot of these damages are huge, but they're way in the future in these computer simulations. Okay, so again, the working group, and when it came up with its latest estimates, it deviated from what the OMB's guidance was. It said agencies traditionally employ discount rates of both 3% and 7% in accordance with particular circular. Right? So again, they're saying the standard rule was when you're reporting costs and benefits, do it at both a 3% rate and a 7% rate. And then they gave permission and said, if for some reason you want to use another rate, go ahead too, if you think that's warranted, whatever the context is, in addition to the 3% and the 7%. But they didn't do that when it came to this report of the social cost of carbon. And let me just show you how big of an impact that has. So this is again coming from the working group's May estimates update of the social cost of carbon. So this is typically the headline number that you saw in the media. These are the ones that they would have reported if you read a news story about the update probably. And what they picked there, that was at a 3% rate. Okay, so they're running all the computer simulations and discounting those future benefits and possible or benefits and damages at a 3% rate, and those are the numbers you get. They also reported it at a 2.5% and a 5% rate. So these far right columns here were what was in the working group's estimates, and just look at the impact it had. Just let's focus on 2010, for example. So they were saying at a 3% rate, the social cost of carbon is $33 a ton, meaning if EPA wants to impose a regulation that causes compliance costs to American businesses on the order of $33 a ton for every ton of carbon that they don't emit now because of the impact of the regulation, that could be justified because we're gaining that $33 in benefits using a 3% rate. If they use the 2.5% rate, the social cost of carbon for 2010 is $52, but if they use the 5% discount rate, they themselves are reporting it would only be 11. So just look at that. Just cutting the discount rate in half from 5% to 2.5 means what they're reporting as the social cost of carbon goes from $11 to $52. So this is partly what I mean, that you don't want to think about the social cost of carbon as some fact of nature out there that we just have to measure with ever more precision. I can more than quadruple the number just by tweaking the discount rate. So what I'm saying is, what would it be if they had followed OMB guidance and reported it at 7%? They can go ahead and report it at other rates too, that's fine, but this guidance said use a 3% and a 7%, and they just didn't report it. And my guess is we can't know exactly without getting into the models and running the simulations ourselves, but it would be close to zero, I would think, and conceivably even negative. And let me just show you why I say that. So again, this is something where if you want these slides, just email us and we'll give them to you, and you can look at this more carefully. This slide here I took from the working group's latest update, and it's just showing you graphically the impact of the discount rate. So up here, this is the legend. The blue is the 5%, the green is the 3%, and the red is the 2.5. So this is the probability distribution over the social cost of carbon, because they didn't just come up with a number, there's a distribution because it's uncertain. But you can see how when they up the discount rate, it all gets squished to the left. So down here, this is the social cost of carbon. So the more to the left it is, that means the lower the number. So you can see the huge impact of increasing the discount rate. It pushes it all up here, so it's piling up right around 0. And you can see even here, it's to the left of 0, these blue bars, and that's showing that in those fractions of the computer simulations, at a 5%, because this is 5%, the number it was spitting out was a social cost of carbon that was negative. So you can imagine, looking at this pattern, if they had said reported 7%, it would be over here. It'd be scrunched even further to the left. And so again, we don't know exactly what the number would be, but it would be much closer to 0 and conceivably negative. And so that's, my suspicion is that's partly why they wouldn't want to report it at the 7% rate, because it would look awkward if the social cost of carbon is $52 a ton at 2.5%, but negative 13 cents or something at a 7% rate. So, okay. Okay, so last minute here, let me just give you the takeaway points. I know I covered a lot of material, so let me just make sure you didn't get lost there and you get the main points. So many studies predict that the net global damages from CO2 emissions won't even occur till the year 2055 or beyond. And I think that's at odds with, we hear stuff in the media about this, that, oh, it's happening right now and the impacts are already upon us. And, experts agree we need to take immediate action. The question is just how severe of the action. And I'm saying in the published literature, the net damages don't really start kicking in until decades in the future. Now, that doesn't mean that it's, a lot of it's baked into the cake, so don't misunderstand me. The authors of those studies aren't necessarily saying there's no problem, but the point is the narrative that's been pushed out there is not corresponding to what the economics literature says. As additional studies have been published over the last decade or so, the estimates of the social cost of carbon are getting more uncertain, meaning they're not narrowing in on an agreed upon number, that by changing assumptions, by trying different modeling approaches, it's getting more uncertain. So there's less consensus in that respect. But at the same time, they've typically come down. If you looked at the average of these published studies, that the results are making it less pessimistic, that they're saying now, you know what, the impacts of climate change are not as bad as they might have thought 10 years ago. And then the last point is, if the administration working group, both in this 2010 initial estimate and then the 2013 update that just came out in May, if they had followed the 2 standard OMB guidelines that they themselves acknowledge are the guidelines in this context of reporting a domestic social cost of carbon, so doing cost-benefit from the perspective of the U.S., and including the 7% discount rate as one of the values to report, then the official White House's estimate of the social cost of carbon would be virtually 0, I believe. We don't know for sure, but it would probably be close to 0 or conceivably even negative. And again, what would that mean? It would mean using their own framework and their own economic models, they would have to say, oh, emitting CO2 is socially beneficial, so the government should subsidize it. Right, so again, what's my point here is that it's just showing you this term of the social cost of carbon gives this false sense of precision, this objective scientific thing out there, when it's driven largely by assumptions. You can make it very high, very low, conceivably even negative, just by tweaking things plausibly. It's not that you have to make up some outrageous assumption. These are all plausible things. So if someone wants a high social cost of carbon, they can go get it. They can pick the people to run the models and have it come out that way. Okay, thanks for your attention, and we'll turn it back to Rob.
Thank you very much, Bob. And now, from the theoretical world of economics, Ross McKittrick.
Thank you, Rob. So, if all goes well, my presentation, yep, there we are. Okay, I want to talk about 2 ideas that connect to carbon taxes. One, the double dividend, which has already been mentioned, and the other, tax interaction. The idea of using taxes to correct externalities or external costs has been around in the economics literature at least since the 1920s. And the basic idea in a simple theoretical context is if you put a charge on the emissions equal to what we call the marginal damages, or what was just referred to as the social cost of carbon in the case of CO2 emissions, if you put that tax in place, then all the market activity that follows in response to the tax will yield the optimal outcome in the sense of the allocation of the abatement activity throughout the economy. The market will be induced to find out the least cost way of reducing emissions and the appropriate level to which to reduce emissions and how to distribute that burden of abatement throughout the economy in the most efficient way possible. And one of the points about the Pigouvian literature here, or the emission tax literature, is that we don't really care at this point what happens to the revenue. Simply by dealing with an uncontrolled externality in an economic model, you can create a welfare gain. You can make the economy better off. Whereas in all other cases when we analyze taxes, when you put a tax in place, you make people worse off. And in fact, the standard economic analysis of taxes contains what's called the Harburger triangle, or the deadweight loss triangle, which means you have to destroy more than $1's worth of economic welfare to raise $1 for the government. So taxes always create deadweight losses, with the exception of emission taxes, which in principle can be welfare enhancing as long as you're moving emissions from above their optimal level down to their optimal level. Of course, you can overshoot that and get into a welfare reduction space, but I'll assume that we're not there yet. So in the 1990s, as the CO2 issue came to the fore, something different came up, which was, in most cases when we think about emission taxes, these would be very tiny markets. You have fairly small amounts of money, fairly small tax rates. They don't really show up in a macroeconomic sense, but CO2 would be different, because for the United States, for instance, if you're starting with 1.5 gigatons of carbon emissions and you put a $30 per ton tax in place and that gets you to 1.2 gigatons, I'm just making those numbers up, that's $36 billion. So then you start getting into potential macroeconomic effects, and so economists had to think a bit more seriously about how carbon taxes would interact with the rest of the tax system. And so there are two issues to think about. So first of all, what do you do with all this revenue? The instinctive answer in economics was you use the carbon tax revenue to pay for reductions in other taxes. In other words, when we do the analysis, we assume that there's a constraint put in place that the government doesn't collect any more taxes than it did before the carbon tax. So you're going to use that revenue to reduce your most distortionary taxes at the margin. In doing so, since every tax has its own excess burden amount attached to it, if the carbon tax generates a smaller excess burden than, say, a payroll tax that gets reduced, you could potentially move to a slightly more efficient tax system. And this is where the term the double dividend got coined, that you put in the tax ostensibly to deal with some kind of pollution externality, and in the process, you made your tax system slightly more efficient. And so in the 1990s, people began throwing around this idea of the double dividend. However, there's a second component to it, which I'll get to, which is the tax interaction effect. The new tax that comes in place on consumer goods, namely fuel consumption, raises consumer costs, reduces real wages, and those have direct effects, but they also affect those excess burdens that are associated with the taxes in all those markets. Okay, so the double dividend hypothesis came out in a couple of different forms back in the 1990s. There was an overly strong or overly optimistic version of it, which was that once you take it into account, emission taxes are always welfare enhancing no matter what the circumstances. So this got a bit of play at the time, but there's obviously lots of flaws with that reasoning. The emission taxes aren't always welfare enhancing, especially if you overshoot the optimum and you're into a region of overkill on your environmental policy. The weaker version of it was that once revenue recycling is taken into account, we should revisit this old classical rule of setting the tax equal to marginal damages, and now we should have a new rule that says we'll set the tax higher than marginal damages, or in this case, higher than the social cost of carbon, because we need to take into account this double dividend argument. However, model simulations, computable general equilibrium model simulations that were done on this topic didn't back that idea up. And where that idea seemed to come from was in a very simple economic model where it makes sense if you do it, although it won't make sense when I say it now. But if you construct a model economy where there's no tax system, and then you introduce a carbon tax, that's what the classical model has in mind, so there's no existing distortions in the tax system. In that case, yes, you get a double dividend, but you don't have any tax interaction effects. So when the analysts who do this kind of work began to introduce enough detail into the tax system so they could get the revenue recycling effect, they also noticed that once you get more detail in the tax system, these tax interaction effects kick in. Now this graph here, I won't go over it in any real detail, but the dotted lines, these are showing on the horizontal axis the percentage carbon emission reduction target, and on the vertical axis the marginal economic cost of the carbon emission reductions. The dotted lines are from a model that has no pre-existing fuel taxes in it. The solid lines are the model that has a pre-existing fuel tax system in it, and then the lower line in each pair is the carbon tax, the higher line is the cap and trade system. So the whole set of cost curves shifts up once you take into account the pre-existing fuel taxes. So carbon tax interacts with that market, exacerbates the excess burden associated with those pre-existing fuel taxes to such an extent that in this analysis, which was in the American Economic Review in 1996, the authors found that in an economy with pre-existing fuel taxes, your very first ton of CO2 emission reductions, even if it's done with a revenue-neutral carbon tax, costs $25 per ton, and then the costs go up from there. The very first ton of carbon emission reductions from cap and trade costs $55 a ton. And so the authors pointed out, given the typical estimates of marginal damages, that means it just would never pass a cost-benefit test. Okay, so yeah, with estimated marginal damages of about $5 a ton, this means the optimal policy would be to have no carbon tax at all. Or in other words, the optimal tax here is less than marginal damages. So that ties back into that earlier point that I made. Once you take into the account the double dividend, doesn't that mean you want to tax higher than marginal damages? But these kinds of analyses were coming out and saying, well, actually, no, you should have an optimal tax below the level of marginal damages. And so this led to some thinking about why does a pre-existing tax system matter? And so there was a fair amount of theoretical work done on this in the 1990s. The new carbon tax, as I mentioned, it raises consumer prices, reduces real wages, and you add a revenue neutrality condition into the model. So that means you have to adjust other tax rates to deal with this. And it's those adjustments to the other tax rates and also the shrinking of some of the other tax bases that exacerbates the distortions associated with the other taxes. So then the question is, okay, which effect is larger? You get a benefit from revenue recycling, your double dividend benefit. In other words, using the new carbon tax revenue to reduce some other tax rates. But you also have a cost associated with all these tax interactions. Which effect is larger? Now, in a simple model that was published in '95 by Ian Perry, his argument, just looking at the interaction between an energy-type market with carbon emissions and a labor market, it's likely, under typical empirical conditions on elasticities, that the tax interaction effect would be larger. In that kind of a model, the optimal tax would be defined according to this formula, which I won't go into detail, but it's in Chapter 8 of my textbook, which is actually titled The Economic Analysis of Environmental Policy, just correcting a point of Rob's there. The way to think about this is the optimal tax should be marginal damages plus a term that reflects the change in the deadweight losses in the other markets. And that second term only goes to zero if you already have a tax, if you don't have a tax system, or if you have a labor market where the labor supply is fixed. And since that's not generally going to be the case, the second term matters. And typically, the second term is going to be negative, so the optimal tax should be less than marginal damages. So in typical economies, and the particular empirical case here is that if you think of the labor tax rate being on average maybe 33%, I know it's probably higher than that, but that gives us the inverse of 33% would be 3. You'd need a labor supply elasticity greater than 3 for that term to go positive, and that's just not going to happen. So the typical result then is that the optimal tax should be less than marginal damages. So here's what that implies in terms of the optimal policy. The way we set this up in an economic analysis is we have emissions on the horizontal axis, pollution emissions, and the price of emissions on the vertical axis. We have the social cost of emissions, or the marginal damages, reflected in some kind of line that might have an upward slope like that. And then we have the marginal cost of reducing emissions is a downward sloping line, or in other words, it's upward sloping if you start at high emissions and you move down to zero emissions. Your marginal cost of reducing emissions has to keep getting higher and higher. And where those lines cross is the classical solution of your optimal emissions level and the optimal price that you should charge on emissions. But now if the optimal price, oops, I wonder if I can, okay, I'll leave it at that for now. I'll come back to that diagram. But you can, anticipating slightly, if the optimal price is down here, that means the optimal level of emissions is going to end up being higher. But I'll show that after a couple more slides. Late in the 1990s, somebody noticed in a comment in the American Economic Review that we're actually reinventing the wheel here. This was actually all thought through back in the 1970s by a Swedish economist, Agnar Sandmo, in a rather little-known article in the Swedish Journal of Economics, where he asked the question, suppose we have a general equilibrium model of an economy, and we solve for the optimal tax system, but we impose the rule that, first of all, the government needs to raise a lot of money, and secondly, it can't rely on lump sum taxes. Has to use ad valorem taxes on prices. What would the optimal tax system look like? Well, lots of people had already thought about it at that point, but he added, what if one of those goods in the economy generates a pollution externality? And so he worked it all out. It's a very intensely mathematical model, but what he worked out was the optimal tax on the externality good should be marginal damages times this adjustment factor R. And R is an index of how distortionary the rest of the tax system is. Now, in the classical case, you have no tax system, so it just equals 1. But in the general case, where you do have an existing tax system, R has to be less than 1. And in particular, R is, formally speaking, the inverse of the marginal cost of public funds, which I'll explain that. I mentioned before the classical or the standard result in the analysis of taxes is that you have to destroy more than $1's worth of economic welfare to raise $1 for the government. So the typical marginal cost of public funds for the U.S. economy would work out to be somewhere around 1.4, meaning you lose $1.40 worth of consumer and producer welfare to generate $1 more for the public sector. So the inverse of that would be about 0.7. So that means this optimal externality tax should be about 0.7 times the value of marginal damages, or about 70% of marginal damages. Now, in Sandmo's article, he does explain, this seems a bit counterintuitive. 2 minutes. The more distortionary your tax system is, the lower the price on externalities should be, but it actually does make sense in the public finance context, because the more distortionary tax system is, the costlier it is to provide public goods, and externality control is a form of public goods. Okay, so if we apply this to the carbon tax, let's take the administration's shiny new estimate of the social cost of carbon at $38 a ton. For all the reasons that Rob mentioned and many more besides, we'll assume that that's probably at least twice what it should be. So we'll say $19 a ton. Now we reduce that by 30% to take into account the net tax distortion effect. So we're down to about $13 a ton. What does that mean? Well, in this case, the demand is inelastic for CO2 emissions because they're derived from fossil fuel consumption. And fossil fuel markets are very inelastic. They're very price insensitive. So if you put a carbon tax in place at that rate, your emissions really wouldn't change. So at the conclusion of that, it would make sense to ask, why even bother? If for all the cost and the disruption of imposing a carbon tax, you're going to end up with more or less the same emissions that you had initially. We could easily ask, why bother? And this also goes back to some of those CGE calculations before. Once you take into account all the hidden costs of policies, that first unit of emissions reduction probably cost you more than even an optimistic estimate of the benefits of reducing the emissions. So looking at this from an optimal pricing point of view, you end up so close between the resulting emissions level and the unregulated emissions level, that it wasn't worth bothering in the first place. So, to summarize, interactions of carbon taxes with the rest of the tax system need to be taken into account because these are large taxes, large amounts of money. They have macroeconomic consequences. Theory and empirical work indicates that the negative tax interactions dominate the gains from revenue recycling. The optimal tax rate is less than marginal damages, and in fact is so low in this case that the change in emissions would likely be negligible. And so the standard proposals for a carbon tax as a policy measure are likely not worth the cost. And one final point here, one of the differences between the economic approach to carbon pricing and more of an activist approach, I guess you might say, is that when we talk about carbon pricing, we really have a target on the price axis, not the quantity axis. So the point of introducing, say, a $15 a ton carbon tax is that people would pay $15 per ton, not that you would hit some arbitrary target on the quantity axis. So when people start talking about why it would be a good idea to use a carbon tax and then they pull some magic number like a 30% emission reductions out of their hat and say carbon tax would be a good way of hitting that quantity target, right away they've gone off sensible economic analysis unless they can show that that 30% reduction is somehow the point where marginal damages and the marginal costs of emission reductions are equated, and that's really not likely to be the case given how inelastic fuel markets are in an economy like the U.S. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ross. And now we have Ken Green, whose own views on energy taxation, carbon taxation have evolved over the years. Ken?
Thanks, Rob. Normally when people say their views have evolved, it's not considered a positive thing, but not in this town anyway. But I'd like to thank IER, Rob and Bob, for having me over, having me down from British Canada. I was in BC and flew overnight, so if I'm a little sniffly, it's because I was in a giant flying can with 300 people and all of their various scents and germs and the like. I'll try not to infect anyone. I want to thank Rob also for conveying on me a doctorate in economics. I didn't have one before. He misspoke, actually. My doctorate's in environmental science and engineering, but I've been doing environmental policy analysis for about 20 years now. So I'm going to give I'm not using PowerPoint, as you see. Power corrupts. PowerPoint corrupts, absolutely. And so I will just speak from my notes. But first, a bit of background. I started working on, and by the way, also this will be a jargon-free presentation, which is because I'm not an economist. So it should be a little easier on the eye and ear, hopefully. So I started working on climate policy in 1997 in California at the Reason Foundation. One of my colleagues is here in the audience, Ron Bailey, former colleagues, and moved to Canada for a while, where I worked at the Fraser Institute in British Columbia on the same issues, and then 7 years inside the belly of the beast here at the American Enterprise Institute. Now I'm back in Canada, in Calgary, for the Fraser Institute, where I was greeted by one of the biggest floods in Alberta's history a couple weeks ago. While I was in the States, at that time I was watching as the U.S. was edging toward very bad climate policy. They were looking at cap and trade, they were looking at regulations, and the consensus at the time when I was at AEI was that some sort of national climate policy was going to get through. And what would be better than the disaster that was looming of cap and trade, which seemed to have legs to make it through. So a lot of studies suggested cap and trade regulation would be bad. Some of my colleagues and I decided to take a look at this. Steve Hayward, Kevin Hassett, and I in 2007 wrote a piece called Climate Change Caps versus Taxes, exploring what an ideal carbon tax would look like and comparing that to cap and trade and regulation for the impacts. We modeled a $15 a ton carbon tax and found at the time that it would result in about an 11% decline in CO2 emissions, which is non-trivial, while raising non-coal-based energy forms only modestly. Coal-based energy prices, not surprisingly, would be affected more strongly, which is to be expected in any plan intended to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We found that if you rebate all the revenue toward the distortionary taxes, reducing distortionary taxes, that you could minimize the impacts of the tax and under some rare and extremely unlikely circumstance provide economic benefits. Now, we never actually said we thought a tax like was a good idea. We never said actually that we wanted to do it. We simply said, our exact words were, if you want to structure it thus, a carbon tax, well, what we said is if you want to structure it this way, it will do less harm than that way. What we actually said was, for these reasons, we conclude that if aggressive actions are to be taken to control greenhouse gas emissions, carbon-centered tax reform, not greenhouse gas emission trading, is the superior policy option. The way I always thought of that was, I'd rather be slapped on the hand than slapped on the face than punched in the nose. I'd rather not be any of those things, but I can certainly say one is better than the other, or less bad than the other. But still, carbon tax supporters thought that meant I was in their camp, and I got invited to all sorts of roundtables, and got to be on the radio a lot, and got to be on the television a lot, got yelled at by certain members here in the audience, from the other side, from the free market perspective a lot. And everybody thought, Ken's the carbon guy now, we've got him, he's on our side. So, but a funny thing happened, as they say, on the way to the forum. I noticed that none of the people who wanted me on their panels or their shows or whatever who supported a carbon tax supported anything like the ideal carbon tax. Not a single one wanted true revenue neutrality. Not a single one wanted the tax actually calibrated to conservative predictions of future harms. Not a one, and I'll talk more about this later, ever suggested they would trade a single regulation away for a carbon tax. Instead, what I found is that they didn't want carbon taxes instead of, they wanted carbon taxes and trading systems and regulations. And I finally decided that discussing an idealized carbon tax pretty much at all just plays into the hands of those who want to lay on this very non-idealized tax regime. So in 2011, I wrote that watching states loot their dedicated eco-taxes for general revenue, seeing the emergence of more proposals for revenue-raising carbon taxes and such, I have to admit that my friends in the free market movement were right. A carbon tax would simply become another general revenue tax and a step in carbon seduction. I think I coined that term, carbon seduction, which is, oh, come on, you've already accepted the tax. Now take a regulation and maybe a cap and trade scheme. It's always that first potato chip that gets you, right? So let's look at a little bit of carbon tax reality, starting from where carbon tax proponents are right on the carbon tax. Carbon taxes are better than cap and trade, which is better than regulations. You could spend days talking about why cap and trade is a horrible idea, and I did. And an ideal carbon tax would probably do only modest damage to the economy. That's where they get it right. Now where do carbon tax proponents get it wrong? This is, sorry to say, a much longer list. Well, first, as somebody mentioned earlier, carbon taxes are not strictly a tax on bads. That is, greenhouse gases. They're a tax on economic inputs because virtually everything we do in the economy requires the use of energy, and significant energy use generates greenhouse gases. So hence, even if you wanted to discuss it as a Pigouvian tax, it doesn't really work, or a tax on externalities, because it's actually also a tax on production. As Ross indicated, it's also untrue to say that we don't have carbon taxes already. We do. The US and Canada and much of Europe have dozens, in fact, of carbon taxes. They're just hidden in the form of vehicle fuel economy standards, appliance standards, renewable fuel mandates, building insulation standards, etc. Pretty much all the conservation measures you can think of are hidden carbon taxes, because in the US and Canada as well, we have other regulations that govern other pollutants, right? Hazardous air pollutants are already regulated elsewhere. The only reason to lay on these kind of efficiency standards is to reduce energy use, not the pollutants necessarily that go with them. As I mentioned earlier, carbon taxes won't be in lieu of, they'll be on top of. And in fact, they'll be, I've never heard of it, like I said, offer to take away the vehicle fuel economy standards in exchange for a carbon tax. If you ever want to see the sincerity of them, just say, okay, can we kill the new Obama vehicle fuel economy standards? Because after all, I'm taxing the carbon. That's what you want me to do. You shouldn't really care. You should be indifferent to whether or not, right, I drive a truck or I drive a hybrid, as long as you've got the carbon tax. And not one will go that way. And imagine if they did, though, right? Imagine if they did. What do you think the automakers would say, having retooled their lines, if somebody came back and said, oh, well, we were only kidding with that. We have a carbon tax now, so, right, so we don't need the vehicle fuel economy standards, and, you know, it's all going to be Ram 150s from here on. So all you guys who were spending all the money on small cars, well, too bad. And those efficient refrigerators that cost $600 extra, sorry, people can go buy them from China if they want to, as long as they pay the carbon tax on their electricity use. We don't care. So then there's the issue of carbon taxes being regressive, which they are. But you can fix the regressivity problem by taking money and giving extra money to the people who are poor. What I mean by regressive is that poor people spend a bigger share of their household income on energy than better off people. And it makes perfect sense, right? You live in an older, less insulated house. You drive an older, less fuel-efficient car. You drive longer to work because you can't afford to live where you work necessarily. You live in remote suburbs. And so you wind up spending much more on energy as a share of your household income. And you can fix that by taking the revenue and giving it back disproportionately to the people who are poor. The problem is when you do that, first of all, you increase the economic damage of the tax because you're not using it to reduce income taxes since the poorer people have less income and pay lower taxes. But you're also taking away the signal, the very signal you want to create, which is for them to reduce their carbon emissions. If I make you whole again, you have a limited reason to go insulate your house or get a new car or whatever. So you've not only increased the damage of the scheme, you've cut the effectiveness of the scheme. But if you don't address the regressivity, you will never get the scheme in the first place. Carbon taxes are also geographically discriminatory. Some places have a lot of hydropower, right, particularly up in Canada. Some provinces have huge amounts of hydro potential. It's cheap and it's abundant and makes sense to use it. Others have lots of shale and oil and gas. And other places have lots of coal. And it's not as if you can simply change the nature of the fuels you have in your geographic region to reflect the national tax. And so you're going to have regional discrimination. Again, you can fix that by giving tax transfers from the blue states to the red states. How many people think that's going to happen? But again, even if you did, right, you're still making harming the economy more and undermining the actual practices you want, which is conservation and things like that. So the odds of a carbon tax being implemented in a real-world sense, according to the textbook models that you've seen that render them harmless and bring on reductions, is extremely slim and unlikely. And I've never seen one proposed in the U.S., at least outside of opinion columns. There are carbon taxes. If by some miracle you got one of those implemented, it wouldn't last long. There are two carbon taxes in Canada, one in Alberta, the province of Alberta, which is where I live these days, and one in British Columbia. Both of those taxes are relatively young. The British Columbia tax, I think, is 6 years old. The Alberta tax was first. The Alberta tax is a weird hybrid tax. It's not really a tax. It's actually an emission intensity reduction target, plus if you can't make that, you pay a fee to the government, and they invest it in research, and go round and round we go. The British Columbia tax, however, was close to the ideal tax, imposed at a low level, revenue neutral, used to reduce distortionary taxes, slow rate of growth. But it's interesting that after only 5 years old, in the last election in British Columbia, the environmentalists wanted to decouple the tax from revenue neutrality and double it, hike it, right? And take a chunk of the money to invest in their favored research programs like solar power and wind power and electric cars and the usual Solyndra litany. And in Alberta as well, the proposal now they're saying that if Alberta doubles its carbon tax, that somehow that'll change President Obama's mind about Keystone, as if he cares what is done in Alberta. I assume he knows where it is, but maybe not a good assumption. But so an ideal carbon tax has a life expectancy of a couple of years before environmentalists say, well, that was nice, now let's decouple it, we'll take the revenue and let's increase the tax. And of course, we've seen that already playing out here in the U.S., as Ross discussed and Bob discussed. You've already seen a hike in what would be the carbon tax rate, which is the social cost of carbon. It was $22 a ton before. It went up recently raised from $22 a ton to $36 a ton, which if you had a tax in place that was calibrated to that, would have given you a 67% tax hike with the stroke of a pen from EPA. Finally, how much time do I have? 2 minutes, great. Governments are notorious for raiding dedicated funds. This is another reality, which is, well, it'll be revenue neutral, and how long it will stay that way. Governor Brown, environmentalist, right, recently raided California's dedicated green fund that raises money through the cap and trade system to the tune of $500 million, which he borrowed. He promises to pay it back, as other trust funds that have been looted have always been paid back, with interest, he says. But of course, environmentalists are pointing out that that he's not going to be able to repay the time, right? So all of the time that they don't have the money to invest in their favorite schemes, they're not getting the emission reductions or technology investments they want. And so even though if he does borrow it and pays it back at interest, it represents essentially putting the program on hold for the sake of general revenues. And again, the final points would be that the unilateral imposition of such a tax would offer little to no climate benefit. Everybody understands that. Even if the United States were practically shut down, Canada could close down entirely. But if the United States did shut down, it still would not be reflected in a significant alteration of the global temperature trends in the year 2100 or 2050. If everybody else in the world did go along, as my colleague Ben Zeiker at AEI has pointed out, we'd have an international climate cartel with tax rates set in Europe and imposed on democratic countries undemocratically, which would be considerably worse than the alternative. Such regimes are highly undemocratic. Finally, some conservatives are saying, well, we'll take the climate issue off the table. If we have a carbon tax, you have conservatives arguing, right, let's do a carbon tax and that solves the problem. But it won't solve the problem because efficient taxation of carbon emissions is not what environmentalists want. For one thing, it lets you decide to go ahead and emit, right? You can pay the tax. It is not, as Ross pointed out, a cap on emissions. It's a price on emissions. And environmentalists have said this overtly. They don't want a carbon tax. They'll take one as a seduction issue, but they don't want them. And what they really want is to force energy consumption down entirely because they believe that that's what enables humans to make an environmental footprint. And they see energy control as their best way to do that, and they're probably right. Also, environmentalists won't suddenly vote Republican because there's a carbon tax. The president won't suddenly accept the Keystone Pipeline because there's a carbon tax. You won't hear the environmental groups cheering for the development of Alberta's oil sands because you have a carbon tax, because after all, Alberta has a carbon tax. Nothing will change in terms of the political dynamic if you have a carbon tax, right? And in fact, on day one of the post-carbon tax world, the environmentalists would say, this tax is not, we have a new study, tax is 3 times too low. And if you don't go along with it, they're going to say, look, you're a denier. You're a science denier. Here's our study. It says it's too low, and it has to go up. And how many people have read the headline, new study shows climate worse than ever before? Right? Have you ever seen the other headline, climate change not as bad? No. So it's a one-way ratchet to a high tax. My conclusion is in the rarefied world of economics, where people like Kevin Hassett, my former colleague at AEI and others, create elaborate schemes of taxation that are rebated in certain ways toward the most distortionary taxes and with high efficiencies gathered through things like a sales tax because that's the least, it costs you the least extra money to raise a dollar of tax and all that kind of thing. You can construct wonderful models in which a carbon tax is relatively benign. However, we don't live in that world. The world we live in is one where any carbon tax would soon be perverted to the basic desire of government, which is to secure new revenue streams that are hard for you to avoid, hard for you to actually measure or see in your bills you pay, and that can be diverted to whatever use they want to put them to because there is no such thing as the government lockbox. Mr. Gore had that part right. What we need is a lockbox, but we don't have any. With that, I'll stop. Thank you very much. I'll be glad to take questions after at the end of the session.
And speaking of questions, we have one more speaker, so if you can start jotting down your questions, raise the note card, they will be collected and given to me. Well, we've heard adjectives so far about the carbon tax: subjective, malleable, regressive, additive, discriminatory, seductive. But what would this tax mean to individuals in the economy? And our final presentation by David will look into some of the modeling results. David?
I'll add one more adjective, bad. So that will describe the carbon tax. What we did at Heritage is we took the code that the Energy Information Administration has developed for their NEMS model, the National Energy Modeling System, and my colleague Kevin Diaratna, who is here, has helped us implement it at Heritage, and I think the one person who's probably most responsible for developing the NEMS model is on the front row here. Mary Herzler, we thank you very much for your help and for developing that. So we took Our version of the NEMS model, which we're not allowed to call the NEMS model, and I can understand why EIA doesn't want people taking their name, but it's pretty close. And we looked at the Boxer Sanders carbon tax. What we modeled was a $20 per ton tax on carbon dioxide that rises at 5% per year. What impact would that have? Before I start going over what those impacts are, by the way, there's a sheet that I have. Everybody should have gotten one. If you didn't get one, raise your hand. Maybe Kevin can give it to you that shows the results, because I don't have PowerPoint. It says, economic impact of Boxer Sanders carbon tax is what the sheet says. There are two impacts of any tax, all right? And Ross talked about that. He said there's the dead weight loss, and then there's the revenue generated. Let me give you an extreme example to help illustrate what we're talking about. Suppose somebody said, let's have a $3 million per gallon tax on dairy products. What would that do? Well, for the sake of argument, let's say Bill Gates buys 1 gallon of ice cream per year, and nobody else buys any, which I'm not sure about Bill Gates buying one, but I'm pretty sure the rest of us wouldn't buy any. What impact would that have on the economy? Well, the revenue generated would be $3 million. And in DC, they say, okay, we can give this back to the people and it's revenue neutral. So everybody gets a penny. We'll lower their income tax by a penny. We're done. There's no impact. But the actual impact of the tax is the destruction of the dairy industry. We no longer have dairy farms. We no longer have the ice cream manufacturers and so on. So that is the damage to the economy. And when I talk about the numbers, the lost income, I'm not talking about the transfer. I'm not talking about the $3 million that Bill Gates is paying for the gallon of ice cream. When we look at the damage numbers, we're talking about the actual shrinking of the economic pie, and how much is that per family of 4? I would add, by the way, that it's pretty clear to me, after being in D.C. for 5 years, that Washington's definition of revenue neutral is that the Congress will promise to spend all the revenue. You know, that's their neutrality. We're not keeping any for ourselves, and it's all going for programs that they think are great. Well, let's look. What happens with this $20 per ton of carbon dioxide tax that rises? We looked at it up through about 2030. A family of 4, all right, the economy shrinks by $1,000 per year per family of 4. So that's not a trivial hit. Now, we can see why that happens. The carbon tax drives up energy prices, all right? There are some alternative energies that can come in that have less carbon or no carbon. But when we look at the number, when we run the model, we see that they're not ready for prime time. What happens by 2030? The carbon tax shuts down about 30% of the total electricity. That is, we look at the coal-generated electricity, goes very low, and the amount of coal-generated electricity we lose corresponds to 30% of the total electricity we would have had. What makes up that gap? So we've created a gap from the lost coal production. Renewables. Renewables make up about 3% of that lost 30%. So there's no magic. We're going to impose this restriction on the economy, and people are going to invent our way out of it, and we're going to have all kinds of windmills and solar panels and who knows what. All right. The remainder of the gap is made up in equal parts from natural gas. Even though it's taxed, it's still cheaper than coal. And if we run the model out further, you don't even get that option. Nuclear, because we didn't put the political constraint that if we don't change the regulatory structure, you're not going to get much more nuclear. So we gave away too much on that, to be honest. And then the third part is they call it in D.C., they call it conservation. What the rest of us call it is doing without, all right? You simply can't afford to buy it, so you use less energy. So there's no magic coming here. Saying we're going to have a carbon tax, we're taxing a bad, is like saying we're going to have a tax on eggshells but not on eggs. You know, right now, you can't get an egg without an eggshell. There's some renewables, but we just don't have them able to scale up. So when we're going to have a carbon tax, that's an energy tax. Okay. So you raise the price of production, you've lowered households' income that they can spend on non-energy items. What does that do? That pinches producers from both sides. Higher cost of production, less demand. They don't need as many people. Employment drops in 2016 by 400,000 jobs. That's comparing the baseline to, the baseline employment to the employment we see with this carbon tax. In 2016, it's lower by 400,000. Okay. Gasoline prices rise by 20 cents in 2016 and 30 cents by 2030. Electricity prices rise by 20%. Natural gas prices by 2030 rise by 27%, which is not going to be good for the manufacturing renaissance. If you look at the chart I have here, you can see employment by other industries as well, ones that are sensitive to energy costs. Iron and ferroalloy and steel products drops by 10%. Aluminum products drops by 20%. Coal mining, not too surprisingly, drops by over 40%. That's going to devastate lots of communities. Other non-metallic mineral products, employment drops by 20%. Now, why would anybody want to do that? You can talk about marginal impacts of carbon on this, that, and the other thing. We know it's going to have negligible impact, measurable impact on temperature, which is the supposed bad thing happening with carbon dioxide, is that it's warming the Earth. All right, the global warming. We're going to cut back on global warming. This carbon tax, we're finally doing something about it. Well, much more comprehensive cap and trade bill, as analyzed, as already mentioned, Chip Knappenberger looked at it, and I haven't seen anybody contradict what he said, and came up with an unmeasurable reduction by 2050, a couple of tenths of a degree moderation in whatever increase we're going to have at the high end. This is assuming the IPCC's large sensitivity. We're going to have a reduction maybe of 2/10 of a degree if we did cap and trade. Carbon tax won't even do that. Okay. Why do we want? Flip your page over. Here's why we want it. How about $100,000 to $200,000 in revenue per year? Yes. Okay. This is a revenue generator. I was on a panel at a hearing in Congress back before the Republicans took over the House, and so I was always a minority witness, one of against about 5. They let in somebody by accident next to me who they thought was a majority witness speaking in favor of cap and trade, and he sort of was, but he said, let's take all the revenue and give it back dollar for dollar to the taxpayers. And it was like everybody's looking like, who's he one of our witnesses? You know? And then they would say things like, well, wouldn't spending it on health care be a form of a rebate? Don't you think mass transit is a form of, so all their pet projects, they're trying to twist this around. They want to spend that money. All right, it's totally bogus to think that there's going to be an offset of some less efficient tax. If we believed the political process only enacted a new tax to replace a less efficient existing tax, then we would already have the most efficient tax system except for maybe the carbon tax. Does anybody actually believe that right now, we couldn't readjust some sort of a rates, get rid of one tax and raise another and make it more efficient? No, of course we could. We do not have a particularly efficient tax structure now because when the economists turn over their great plan to the political process, it gets this done to it. They say, see, the economists are justifying this new tax. And so now we get to do what we want with it. And what you will have will be more spending, all right? There may be some reduction somewhere, but it's certainly not going to be dollar for dollar. And that is the whole point of the carbon tax. Okay, well, I think we've talked enough, and time for your questions.
Okay, we have a number of questions, and this will probably do it for us, but if you have another, send it up. Here's a question that I think Robert Murphy would be best to answer, given his understanding of the history of U.S. monetary and fiscal policy. Bob, is there such thing as a non-political federal tax? Another way to ask this question is, can a carbon tax be non-political in light of history?
Well, I guess the way I would answer that is to say, and I talked about this in my study that came out last year for IER on carbon tax swap deals, and I pointed out that it's ironic that right now, the conservative proponents of a revenue-neutral carbon tax are saying we got this onerous income tax that's everyone all agrees very inefficient. We could get rid of that thing and bring in this carbon tax that's less distortionary. That's the claim. And I pointed out that historically, back in 1913, when they brought in the current federal income tax, if you go back and look at the arguments, people back then were saying, let's bring in this income tax because it's so less distortionary than these tariffs, you know, because that's how they raised revenue back then. And we'll get rid of the tariffs, and it's fairer because, you know, let's tax rich people and not tax people based on. So it was ironic that it was the same type of rhetoric used back then that gave the thing that now people are saying, let's get rid of that. And if you remember, famously, it wasn't like they got rid of tariffs, right? It was famous, the Smoot-Hawley tariff is one of the things that people point to is why the Great Depression was so severe. And you had that classic thing in Ferris Bueller's Day Off where he was talking about that, if you remember that. So my short answer, I guess, would be no. It's you like David was saying. You can't, when you bring it in, if there is some theoretical textbook reason that there's going to be an efficiency gain, once they unleash it, they're going to come back and go to the well again and raise taxes.
For Ross McKittrick, does the tax interaction problem imply that carbon taxes make more sense as a component of tax reform rather than as a standalone?
Well, you have to, when you calculate the effect of a carbon tax, you have to make an assumption in the model about what you do with the revenue. So if in the computable general equilibrium papers, which is the stuff I was referring to and what I worked in many years ago, you just impose the assumption at the end of the day the government has the same fiscal stance. It's not running a deficit or changing its surplus or deficit as a result of the carbon tax. So you have to decide what happens to the revenue. And so what we typically do to make the calculation, if you like, as fair as possible is pick a particularly distorting tax, like payroll tax or something like that, that has a high marginal excess burden attached to it, and use the funds to reduce that. So to make the modeling coherent, you have to make it a part of some kind of a tax reform like that. I would point out, though, that even when you introduce a carbon tax, and you can get some benefits from the accompanying tax reform, but they only persist at fairly small levels of the carbon tax. The carbon tax is always a fairly narrow instrument. It's heavily focused on coal and then lesser and lesser on oil and natural gas. So it's a fairly narrow fiscal instrument. And the excess burden of any one tax goes up roughly at the square of the tax rate. So as the carbon tax gets larger and your other taxes initially get smaller, you're still at very low levels of emission reduction. So I was working on this back when Canada was thinking about complying with Kyoto, for instance. And there's no way you could get to Kyoto compliance with revenue recycling giving you a net benefit. You always have, it's always very costly kind of tax to implement, even when you have revenue recycling and double dividend and all that. So the tax interactions are always there for any kind of meaningful implementation.
Okay. Let's see, this might be for Ken Green. You have worked on the state and federal level in your career here in the U.S. The CO2 tax might be a non-starter federally, but what are the chances of states taking it up as policy, as happened with cap and trade?
Well, I think it's more likely as states have formed small groups like the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative and the Western Climate Initiative, and as California paved the way with AB 32 to implement stringent carbon controls. So it's possible, despite the fact that California has managed to convince many people that its environmental regulations had nothing at all to do over time with its current state of economic misery. I have a feeling other states aren't likely to buy that unless they're really very blue states, similar to California. But, I mean, states and provinces have autonomy. They can impose their own taxes. There's nothing that I know of in the law that would stop a state from levying a carbon tax. So it's quite plausible. If you look at the polling, however, on the popularity of the idea of a carbon tax or concern over climate change, it's not very high, and the willingness to pay is very low. So,
okay. This question might be for for David. Is a carbon tax a better way to regulate carbon than EPA rules? And is there a package that conservatives might support for such a swap? EPA rules are being replaced by a CO2 levy.
Well, no. I'm frequently asked, would a carbon tax be better than regulation? And my answer is, and some of you have heard this, it's like asking me what's the most humane way to execute an innocent person. You shouldn't execute innocent people, is my answer. Do we want to talk about the best ways to execute innocent people? I don't know. And my next answer is going to be, and it's been proven to me recently, that when conservatives talk about a carbon tax, and when any conservative says, well, I would be in favor of a carbon tax under this condition. It eliminates child diseases and poverty and so on. The headline says, conservative supports carbon tax. So I'm not going to be drawn into this fantasy world where we speculate on what might happen when we know it won't, when it gives people ammo to misrepresent what I say. So, no.
Okay. That definitive answer eliminates a couple of other questions on what might be tradable here. We have some Twitter questions as well. One of them, Australia just scrapped their carbon tax in favor of an EU-style emissions trading system. Some industry commentators prefer a tax to command and control. Please discuss. Anybody?
Well,
Okay, go ahead.
I mean, it's like saying, here, let me exchange your iron and you're out in the water floating, and somebody hands you an iron anvil instead of a life preserver, and you say, no, this isn't going to work, and you drop it, and they say, okay, here, have a lead one. You know, I do think, though, politically, a cap and trade system is easier to sell because you can basically rig it so many more ways than the tax. You can rig it so that your industries don't have to pay it because you give them credits and you don't auction the permits and you, all of the things that you can, the ways you can use a carbon tax to do, a cap and trade system to do horse trading makes it more politically palatable, and you can avoid having people who are lower income pay anything extra by shifting the incidence of the impact. So it's logical for them to do it, but it's not going to improve the overall situation.
Okay, here's
Rob,
a question.
could I,
Sure, go ahead.
Point. I showed a graph up there of cost calculations comparing carbon tax and cap and trade, and the cap and trade system for CO2 is substantially more expensive, and it's partly because the rents all get captured by the industry, and so there's very little revenue recycling that takes place. The other problem in the European system is all this price volatility, and that's because cap and trade system gives you basically a vertical supply curve of permits in a market where there's a very steep demand curve for permits, and so even small economic fluctuations translate into a huge amount of price volatility, and that's very costly for any industry to deal with. So I think Australia is going to learn that it's not well suited for the CO2 emission case.
This might be a question for a lawyer who's not on the panel, but I'll state it anyway. Could a state implement a carbon tax and have that count as complying with existing or new source performance standards?
I doubt it.
Yeah,
I doubt it. New source review is a pretty hard and fast aspect of the Clean Air Act. It's not related. It's not substitutable, as far as I know, by a carbon tax.
Here's an interesting question, and I think this will be yours too, Ross. We talked a little bit about there being implicit CO2 taxes right now, even though there's not a federal tax by that name through a lot of federal regulations. Does the tax interaction effect have the same implication for subsidies of green energy as it does for carbon taxes?
Yes. So that's an important point about regulatory instruments Sometimes policymakers like them because they're not called a tax, it's not visible, so all those extra costs are really hidden, but they're very real. So like the appliance standards and cafe standards and so forth, if you used a tax on motor vehicle fuels to achieve the same improvement in motor vehicle characteristics in terms of fuel efficiency, people would be really upset by that because they would see that this new tax is in place. We have to go fairly high to hit these proposed CAFE standards that are in the works, and people wouldn't like that. Those costs are identical, or if anything, they're worse, going about it through a regulatory approach. The costs don't go away just because it's not made visible in the form of a tax. They're all still there, and so all the tax interaction effects are just as large. If anything, it's worse because you don't have any revenue generated to do a bit of revenue recycling and reduce other tax rates in response. So a regulatory approach has all the same tax interaction costs. They're just invisible, and so they're all still there.
Rob, can I?
Yes.
I also want to inject another point, which is that the regulatory approach not only is more expensive, it also creates much more probability of perverse incentives. So hence you create new refrigerator standards that get you actually, and you force people to buy more efficient refrigerators. What do they do with their old refrigerator? It becomes the beer fridge in the garage. So now they're running 2 refrigerators instead of 1. If you actually give me a car that goes more miles for less money, well, I have latent demand for that cross-country trip, right? So you drive more. And we've seen that with people who buy hybrids, they drive them more. And people, when the CAFE standards came in, their driving increased. And it's common for people to use more because there's latent demand for energy use almost in most aspects of people's lives.
Here's a general question, and I'll summarize it as saying, why all this academic fuss? The idea of a carbon tax is politically dead. I tried to address some of that in my introduction. These ideas are never dead. This is the 3rd try at a major energy tax, and there could be some form of a carbon tax in a broader package. But did anyone have anything to add to that?
I'll jump in, and maybe you guys want to add to it. One really important thing I want to make sure you guys realize, and why, especially with Ross's presentation, there was obviously academic in nature, but because I just want to make sure you realize there is a push, whether that particular questioner thinks it's not going to go through, that we've seen it with conservatives saying, hey, maybe we should take a look at this thing. If we could get a reduction in these other taxes that we've been pushing for so long, maybe this is what we can do. And hey, for all we know, it might even help the environment, right? And so it's that particular claim that is not supported in the literature, and that's what Ross was trying to point out. So, the point is, if people are going to be making arguments for a carbon tax, and we're not inventing strawmen, people are out there making those arguments, at least they should be backed up. In other words, if you're going to go and make something sort of fairy tale textbook case for it, at least get the textbook claim correct. And that's the problem. It's not merely that, oh yeah, what they're saying is true in the textbook, but in the real world, it'll slip going into implementation. Even in the textbooks, it's not true that a revenue neutral carbon tax necessarily is going to make the economy better. In fact, the best guess is that it won't.
Well, to mix metaphors, it's not dead, Jim. Carbon tax, you read about it every month in conservative groups pushing for carbon taxes, and so the issue is not dead. I equate it to a vampire, right? It's only dead when you stake it through their heart, cut its head off, burn the body, and scatter it over running water, and right, and preferably running holy water. And until then, it's not dead. So.
And perhaps another point to make that I appreciated just from this panel is that we're addressing an explicit federal new carbon tax, but implicitly we have CO2 taxes today in a variety of federal and state regulations. So these arguments apply not only to the hypothetical, what could happen, but they apply to numerous existing programs today. Let's see, we're in our final minute, and what I might do is to challenge at least one of the panelists to give us one takeaway thought. What do you think was the most important thing from your presentation?
what I would like you to take away from what I presented is that this term, the social cost of carbon, is not analogous to something that physicists or chemists could go out and measure. It's not something out there about the world and they go and figure it out. The economists tell, what's the social cost of carbon? Okay, let's now go regulate based on that objective number that the experts have given us. I've just shown you several ways in which you can make that number be virtually zero up to over $100 a ton just by tweaking dials, and you're not a liar. In other words, nobody could point to the mistake you made. That's just how open-ended this is. There's computer simulations going to the year 2300. I can give you any number you want.
So if a tax is inherently subjective rather than objective, that means it has to necessarily be political.
Well, yeah, it will end up being, yeah, sure.
Okay. Ross?
If the idea ever comes up that a carbon tax is somehow a free lunch, that you've got a double dividend that's going to make it completely painless, that's really not the case. There are costly tax interaction effects that kick in at very low levels, and so there's no getting around the fact that a carbon tax would be a very expensive policy for the U.S. to implement, and it needs to be discussed as such, not in some kind of fantasy land where there are no costs associated with it.
Ken?
As Yogi Berra said, in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there is. In theory, you can design a carbon tax that looks harmless and benign. In practice, it will quickly become cancerous and malignant.
Yeah.
And David?
Yeah. A carbon tax is going to have real and negative impacts on the economy. Even the $20 per ton tax that we modeled was well below what the EPA is currently claiming for a social cost of carbon. At that, we're still losing hundreds of thousands of jobs in the next 15 years and trillions of dollars worth of income.
Great. We're right at 2:30. This concludes our program. Thank you very much for coming. And thanks to all our friends on the internet.